Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Reset Now podcast, where we talk about all things reform. I am Thathsarani Siriwardana, your host for the day, and joined with us today is Dr. Ramani Gunathilaka. Doctor, it's good to have you in the show with us.
Thank you, Thathsarani. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we'll be discussing about Sri Lanka's labor law market trends and the reform recommendations that need to be implemented to address the barriers in it. Before getting into the podcast, let me give our listeners a brief introduction about Dr. Ramani Gunathilaka. Dr. Ramani Gunathilaka is an independent consultant, and her researches mainly focus on labor markets and issues related to women employment in Sri Lanka. To set the context for the discussion for the day, so labor reforms is something that Advocata has been talking about for the last couple of years. And this started with the Reform Now conference. Since labor reforms are currently in the discussion in Sri Lanka's society and the political arena, we thought it's important to talk about labor reforms from our side as well. So to talk about the structure of the Sri Lanka's labor market and labor structure of it, some key noticeable aspects of it is basically the the gender gap in the labor force participation, and there's a big informal sector, and there's an aging population. While for the past couple of months we have seen migration also being included in it. To start the conversation off, Doctor, so Sri Lanka's labor force that has always seen a trend in terms of participation of the labor force, there's a gap in it. In terms of always female labor force participation has been lower than the male participation rate. And according to ADB, we are in terms of the gap, we are in the 20th place. So this kind of also shows there's an untapped potential within the labor market itself. So what is actually preventing women from entering into the labor force in the first place?
Yes, actually, I think maybe I should start with by saying that why is it important for women to participate? Of course, it's important for themselves. They have most of them have had free education at the expense of the taxpayer, and uh, they should be able to earn money and get returns on this education, save for their old age because they are likely to be living much longer. For them, it is a question of earning and meeting their potential. But it is also important for the country as a whole. As you mentioned, Thathsarani, we are an aging population. We are a rapidly aging population, and I would say we are the poorest rapidly aging population. Others are aging, but like Japan and South Korea, they are rich. We are going to get old before we get rich. And that is an issue because we are not going to have enough workers. So in that context as well, in an aging population where your working age cohort is shrinking relatively to the dependent population, then you need to look around and see where can we increase labor supply.
Right.
Obviously, when only about 32% of the working age cohort of women are willing or able to participate in paid work, then obviously that is where we can first try to increase labor supply. Then the issue comes up, okay, so these women are mostly relatively educated uh, in along many dimensions. They are better educated than men. And certainly in terms of cognitive skills, Professor Delaney Gunawardana's work has shown that they have more skills than men, though they are earning less when they do get jobs. So why are they not participating, or why are they unable to enter the paid workforce? There are many reasons, and I think the best way to visualize this is in terms of concentric barriers which they have to jump over. The first set of barriers is it relates to themselves and their households. If they have children, it's difficult to go to work. If they don't have the skills that the labor market demands, no. Then there are also things like, well, if your husband is earning enough, or other males in the family are bringing home enough, then maybe you don't need to go to work. You may as well concentrate on your children, and perhaps you're not that educated that you will get a good job with a good pension at the end. Even government servants can no longer live on their pensions when they are old. So it may make sense to stay at home and look after your children and make sure that they get a good education, and then they will look after you in your old age. So these are all rational decisions that women make given the conditions that they are faced with. So there's a range of conditions here. I have only spoken about the ones related to themselves and their households, but also in terms of the local community, the demand for them. A recent study that Professor Sunil Chandrasiri and I did that did show that if your managers, the managers in your enterprise are males, they are less likely to employ women regardless of the structure of the industry. Because now structure also plays a part. When your production structures are low skilled intensive, there are more incentives to hire women because you pay them less also. And then of course the macroeconomic condition, I think, has been the most important. Our economic train hasn't been running. It has to run fast enough so that it pulls people out of uh, other non-paid work into paid work. If you look around the world where women have increased participation in the paid workforce, that is where there has been a huge demand created by certain exogenous factors. In say, European countries, it would be the Second World War, the First and Second World War. In the Far East, it was that huge labor-intensive growth that they experienced. Unfortunately, our train has been limping along. So we are trying to enable women to enter the workforce in a very inhibiting macroeconomic environment.
Also, to add to what you said about the 32% of females participating in the Sri Lanka's labor force, this is according to the definition of, they are saying women who are already employed and also women who are also looking for work.
Yes.
So you are looking at people who are interested in working as well,
Yes.
but also they are not employed.
Yes.
So including all those people, it's just 32%.
Yes.
So there's a lot more untapped potential within the labor market itself.
You're right. I mean, there could be a lot of women who feel thoroughly discouraged and they are not even looking for work,
Yes.
but who may be encouraged to enter the workforce if the incentives and the structures are conducive.
Right. I think, Doctor, you gave a good introduction for our next question, the next part of the conversation as well, which is the aging population in Sri Lanka. I think a lot of people have been talking about it, but necessarily the policymakers haven't been focusing on it. So in 2019, the ADB predicted that Sri Lanka is one of the fastest aging countries in South Asia. And with the population expected to contract by 2038. So has the economic crisis accelerated this issue, according to you?
Yes, actually, I mean, when you speak about it, the hairs rise on my arms. I have to say it is a very frightening prospect, and most economists know that this is a kind of demographic time bomb. You see, the time bomb was ticking before the crisis. As I told you, our population was aging, and our skills development structures weren't producing workers with the skills needed for the workplace. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, our production structures are also dependent on old technologies. Yeah. So we were kind of caught in this vice. where even the young people who are entering the labor markets could not be productively used for economic growth and even for themselves to earn enough to live independently and think of a fairly secure old age. Now, a lot of these factors have intensified after the crisis. Uh, I can think of three ways in which this has happened. First is the crisis has caused a hemorrhage of young people out of the country. Uh, I think data from the Foreign Employment Bureau puts the figure as at about 360,000 or so who left in 2022. But those are only people who are registered with the FEB. I think, I mean, most people say that at least 1 million have gone and they are still going.
Right.
Now, what happens with this is that our problems of skills deficits, skills shortages is just going to increase. They have already increased. That's one thing. And then, of course, wage costs rise because the same number of firms are competing for the same number of skilled workers, for example, who are still here.
Right.
And they are here because they have to look after aging parents. And so you see that demographic situation working out there also. Then there's another thing for the future. You see, if the job situation is bad and you can't migrate and you're a young person, you can't marry.
Yeah.
You have to stay with your parents and you may delay marriage and you may not marry at all. And if you are married, you can't think of having children. So our demographic crisis is going to intensify. Because of this crisis, our birth rates will drop. They were in any case just a little above replacement levels, but that was also only because of the kind of boom which followed the end of the war.
Right.
Now you will have the reverse happening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, I get this sort of almost panic feeling. I think if we can manage to steer our economy into some kind of safe harbor over the next 4 to 5 years, then there may be hope for us because all the young people who have gone, they will get experience, skills, exposure
Right.
about how things are done in other countries, and then they may come back.
Right.
And you may have a kind of uh, a structural break in our growth rate, economic growth rate, because there will be more people who will know to do things better. And also, I think nobody leaves this country uh, because they don't like the country. I mean, this is a beautiful country. Everybody who's outside wants to come back here. It's just that our policymakers have dropped the ball for decades. And now things are very, very difficult. So I think we need to look forward in that sense.
Right.
And try to get our act together so that we can attract back our young people in about 5 to 7 years' time.
And I think one of the points that you mentioned as well, Doctor, because the economy is not growing, the income level, the income that the average person would get will also drop by. So I think in terms of being a young person myself is also kind of concerned in a way. Like for you to have a life here in this country, you need to be able to earn well, right? And while you have your parents, and say you get married, you have your spouse's parents as well, and add to that children. That is not something that you can manage with the current economic sense, right?
No, no, it is very difficult. It is very difficult, and also in a way, in a way, because our demographic transition happened early, we are kind of stuck. You see, if you look at our grandparents' generation, there were 4 generations there. You see, so the children were looked after by their mothers, and the grandmothers would be looking after the great grandmothers.
Right.
You see, so you had 4 generations. Now the middle two have collapsed,
Yes.
and they have to look at both ends.
Right.
And the other thing is, earlier, the people who were healthy lived long without much trouble, and then they died. Now what is happening is, people are living long with all sorts of health conditions, which means more health expenditure and more time required in caring for them.
For sure.
So we are in a very, very difficult situation. I would say that my generation is the first to face this crisis. We are already in there, but for your generation, it is likely to be much worse.
Right. Yes. I think, Doctor, since one of the points that you also mentioned was migration, I think almost all of us know that migration has been happening with the economic crisis. It has intensified. And talking about it, migration is also kind of like a brain drain from the country itself. But if you look at the actual quantity of people migrating and the fact that most migrations happen at the skilled and unskilled levels, what will be the long-term effect on this?
Yes, so now basically the people who are going are the ones for whom there are jobs abroad, right? So yes, the skilled people are going, and the unskilled people are also going. So what we have left are the middle skilled people who in any case were not very employable anyway.
Right.
So 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 really, again, I'm getting this feeling of anxiety when I think about it. What we need to do is, we will need to upskill those people. So now there are 2 lots we have to look at. One is the group of people, young people, who are already in the education system. What do we do about them? Then there are people who have left the education system, who may be women running after their children at home, and maybe others who are doing low skilled kind of jobs. So we need to retrain them however we can, and then also make sure that those who are in schools right now leave with the competencies required to be employable.
Right.
Now, if we look at the people in the education system first, now there we have another challenge. What with COVID, right? Schools were closed for a long time. Then now again we have our old sins to deal with, right? Before COVID, there were delays in the system. Only 5% of grade 8 children, year 8 children, passed mathematics, for instance, right? I mean, these are statistics which are well documented, right? So you already had that problem. On top of that, you have COVID and the lockdowns. And then on top of that, you have the economic crisis, right? So last year, with all the transport issues, no diesel, no petrol, people didn't get to school. And then you have the impact of the crisis on malnutrition levels, and that is going to affect the cognitive development of these children. The children who were not able to eat nutritious food, and who still cannot eat nutritious food. So we need to address the issue of nutrition. We need to address the issue of making sure they have the relevant competencies, and so on. Now, the relevant competencies, I really don't think our Ministry of Education is kind of aware of this. I think they are thinking of, right, we need to somehow finish those syllabuses, right? Now, I believe that most of those syllabuses were not very good anyway. There is no need to learn something like health science anymore, right? We learned it, but then we couldn't look it up on Google. Now everybody with a phone, I mean, it is accessible. So I think when it comes to the education system, you have to first think, what are the competencies we want kids to have? Then, regardless of whether it's woodwork or social studies or history or whatever, right, do those bits of those subjects which will ensure these core competencies, like to be able to interpret verbal and linguistic clues, to be analytical. In the sense, it's not what children know, it's what children can do. So we have to completely transform the objectives of our education system. Not going to be easy, because a lot of the people who are taking the decisions about education are those who have done well in the existing. They have whacked A's here, distinctions here. They think that they know, right? Because it worked for them. But you cannot replicate that system, and you shouldn't. It's not going to help at all. We have to transform it completely.
Also, Doctor, something that you have been very vocal about is the fact that the employability of the Sri Lanka's labor force. I think one of the issues, one of the points that you also mentioned like previously as well, in terms of education. So, in terms of Sri Lanka's labor force employability, what are their issues, and do we have kind of solutions for these issues at the moment?
I am not aware of whether people are thinking in terms of practical solutions for this. I don't know what the Ministry of Education is doing. I mean, I learned recently that some subcommittee, parliamentary subcommittee or something, or cabinet subcommittee has been appointed to look into this. I think this is where we need the help of perhaps donors, and look at systems which are imparting the kind of skills that we need. Now, I found out relatively recently about the Danish and Finnish systems. They are not into syllabuses and all that. Whatever testing that takes place is about what kids can do. So I think we need to bring in those ideas, and do something about it in terms of skills. It's going to be a hard upward battle.
Yes. And I think it's really, really important as well, because I think sometimes we forget the fact that when we are teaching our kids, we are also building the next generation, the next labor market in the
Yes.
country.
Yes.
Right. I think most of our policymakers also kind of forgets about it. Hence,
Yes.
there is always, I think that's one of the reasons also for a mismatch in the labor force in the first place. You are not supplying for the demand that is created by the market. That goes to our next question as well. In terms of this skill mismatch in the labor force, why do you think there is a mismatch in the first place in the market?
Well, basically, our children are, most of them are too educated for the jobs that are available. Right? That is the first thing. And that is because our production structures are backward. So there is that kind of skills gap. On the other hand, there are certain sectors which are more advanced. I would say the more sort of industrial and scientific kind of, and then ITC and so on. Now, there the problem is, there is a big demand, but there aren't enough people. And that again is a problem with the general education system, because it is not producing enough people who can do this kind of job. for which there's a demand. And many employers who are in those sectors say that they prefer to get the employees and train themselves. Because otherwise, quite often, many of them come with an attitude
Right.
which they can't cope with. So, what is necessary here is more involvement of firms, private sector people, in deciding what kind of education we need. Now, actually, the ITC sector, there has been ICT sector, there has been some progress there. A lot of the ICT companies are on some kind of councils in, say, Moratuwa University, and they have their input. I think we need to develop those in other areas as well, and basically find out what the private sector wants. But of course, having said that, I mean, we can't keep pointing fingers at government. The private sector also needs to step up. They are always resentful about the fact that they have to train, right? Looking for tax incentives to do that. We are no longer in that situation. I think the private sector needs to proactively engage, even through personal contacts with university professors, school teachers, and come up with some kind of partnership. And it is possible to do that even at say provincial level. You make the now almost every province, every district has a university. You make that the center, and then the private sector comes together with the employers, with the education sector, and develops curriculum and provides internship. You know, the private sector needs to be proactive. They need, because whatever said and done, the skills and the ability, whatever we have, are there.
Sure.
So they need to step up and do what is necessary.
So before we go into our next question, I would like to remind our listeners that in this podcast, we have talked about reforms in sectors such as education, trade, land, and many more. So make sure to tune into our podcast episodes as well. Going back to our discussion, Doctor. So I think one of the points that I've also mentioned by giving the context to the discussion as well is about the informality of the Sri Lanka's labor force. I think we have a formal and informal sector, but while we were discussing as well, the majority of the labor market is also very much informal. And if you take, if I bring a very gendered perspective into this, is like, so Sri Lanka's female labor force participation is 30%, while you see in the informal sector, you have around 47.9% of females in the being employed in the informal sector itself. So how does the cost of labor loss attracts more people into the informal sector rather than the formal sector?
Yes, of course. Now, although people focus on labor laws, there are a lot more laws which cause this problem. Now, for example, take TEVA, terminations, the Termination of Employment of Workmen's Act. Now, that kicks in when the number of employees in a firm uh, tops 14.
Right.
So there is an incentive, theoretically, there's an incentive to keep the firm small and not grow employment. So you will find that there is a conglomerate of little businesses,
Right.
because you register each business separately and you keep it under 15 or 14, which the whole thing, which is inefficient. Now, the World Bank for at least 30 years has been trying to prove that TEVA is a problem. But there is what is known to econometricians as an identification problem.
Yeah.
You see, it's not only TEVA that kicks in at 14. The Inland Revenue Act kicks in at 14, and I would personally think that that is a bigger problem, because you have to pay your tax every year, every quarter now, right? But the termination and compensation only when a worker leaves, which is not every quarter,
Exactly.
probably, right? So there are a whole lot of laws which may encourage businesses to be informal and keep under the radar. And there is a lot of literature worldwide to show that these kinds of barriers uh, incentivize firms or business people to rationally exit the formal sector.
Right.
On the other hand, there are certain barriers which which exclude people from the formal sector because they don't have maybe the skills. I mean, if you have to pay taxes and various other things, you may have to have you may have to have people who know those things. You have to have a dedicated staff member who has to see. So these are all barriers. It's true. But having said that, you can't do away with these things because the fundamental rationale for labor law is unequal bargaining power.
Right.
So what we need to do is to make sure that we can uh, adjust our workforce, our production structures in terms of demand and remaining competitive while not sacrificing the welfare of our workers. It's a hard thing, but it is what we need to do.
Right. Which makes sense. Um, Talking about the labor laws, I think this is where you also came up as a consultant for one of our projects, which was done about gender discriminatory labor laws.
Yeah.
I think that is about mainly about talking about nighttime work, part-time work, flexible time work, and we have been talking this for like past 1 year. I think the conversation started in last 2022, but the research was done before that even. Um, I think with the labor laws conversation coming up, there was a lot of pushbacks from different stakeholders in terms of being these labor laws recognized under the law. So technically, nighttime work, women can't work after 8 p.m. Flexible time work, part-time work is not recognized under the law. What is your opinion regarding this? Do you think this kind of like this setback from the stakeholders happen? Is it because like they have a different opinion to the labor laws that has been discussed so far, or is it just from a perspective of this protectionist, the protecting the women kind of a mindset?
Well, some of these laws began in a sort of a very paternalistic way to protect women. But women workers in factories didn't seem to deserve as much protection as workers in shops and offices. So there was a class issue here as well. And to date, uh, women workers in factories can work at night, but women workers in shops and offices can't.
Right.
So there are certain anomalies in the law like that which we have to rectify, these class-based structures. On the other hand, if you look at part-time work, uh, even the desire to reform laws like that, uh, they make I would say they make economic sense, and I would tell I will go into that in a little while. But I think the process of reform has not been handled wisely.
Right.
Although I have although you know me as having been involved in this for the last 2 years, actually I have been involved in this area since 1995, which is a very long time for you. You may not even have been born at that time. Yes, but the thing is, you see, this was an area in which I first started work as a researcher. And what is noticeable is that there is no effort to discuss between the partners, the industrial partners. This historical adversarial labor relations, which we really inherited, has continued. And in fact, in 1995, when the government tried to introduce a workers' charter to rectify a lot of the problems like discrimination against uh, workers found to be trying to form trade unions, uh, I'm sorry to say, the employers reacted in a very immature way. They scuppered the whole process, which needed discussion and negotiation. There doesn't seem any, we don't seem to have a culture of that in this country, where you recognize the other party's concerns and then you start working with them. We don't have a culture like that. Of course, I have to admit that, not admit, I have to point out that that kind of culture is lacking in many countries. Right? I would say now the Ukrainian war is the biggest and most destructive example of that. So we need to, I mean, everybody knows the laws that have to be reformed. Right? What we need to do is develop a process which will be acceptable, which will be legitimate, and which will address the concerns of both parties. Right. So that is the missing piece here, which needs to be addressed. As for part-time work, I mean, so having said that, you can understand that there is always this historical distrust, because the unions are always expecting the employers to steal a march on them by getting the ear of the political powers involved and being foisted with some reform. On the other hand, the unions, particularly through the large and powerful unions in the public sector, are waiting to block any such reform. Right. So that is why even now I have my doubts that this will go smoothly. Right. As for part-time work, I mean, there have been concerns expressed not only in terms of this. Now, for example, in a recent meeting, Mr. Leslie Devendra, who's the secretary of the Sri Lanka, sorry, it's the old SLFP union. I can't keep up with the changes in names that have been going on since then. I mean, he pointed out that flexible work can lead to exploitation. And you can find people having to work 16 hours a day. So that is true. So what we need to do is we need to put in safeguards which will ensure that people can have work-life balance. Because if you don't have that, you're going to have another problem, which is women will be so stressed, they will be taking all sorts of drugs probably to be able to cope. Apparently, it's rampant in the US. Women cannot cope. Too much to do, too much pressure. So we don't need to, we cannot afford to kill people in order to grow economically. So we need to have those safeguards, but it needs to be discussed. Right. As for part-time work, it's not only women, students. Exactly. Students can do part-time work, help pay for their courses, and most importantly, develop networks, get work experience, so that either they can, I mean, their employability is going to increase, or they will have the experience to start their own businesses. So I would say that these labor reforms related to hours of work are a low-hanging fruit. Right. Get it through fast, but of course make sure that people's rights are protected.
Right. I think that's a very good point that you mentioned, talked about part-time work for students, because I went to a state university. So until I was around 24, 25, I didn't get into a job because I was in this, because it's in the state university system itself, right? Because you do your A-levels and there's like a 1 year gap until you get into the university itself, and there's another 4 years. So because of COVID and the economic crisis, there was lags behind here and there. So until 23, 24, I was not employed. So if there was a part-time system in the place in itself, from the first year onwards, we could have, do our degrees while doing a part-time job. So getting the experience, the exposure while you get your degree. So that is something that should be changed.
Yes, and
very importantly.
that is how we increase the labor supply. And if women could do part-time work even while studying, even they get married and they see to their children, then they will be able to come back to work
Right.
more easily, because they can tell the employers, yes, I worked in this organization, I did this.
Exactly.
I mean, this is actually to hold this back is a national crime. We cannot lose any more time on this. Our situation is desperate. As I told you about the population aging factor, we are in demographic crisis. We cannot hide from this. So this is one way we can hope to come out of this until maybe about 5 to 7 years, when our people come back and help to finally develop our country.
To wrap up our discussion, Doctor, I would like to ask you this one question. So, since the government has taken the initiative of talking about these labor reforms, according to you, what are the areas that they should give priority to?
I would say hours of work.
Right. So basically part-time work.
Part-time work, also laws which enable people to work from home, while you see there are issues. Is working from home like working in the office, or does you do occupational and safety, those laws apply? There are lots of issues like that which need to be worked out. But working from home, part-time work, and flexible working hours, where in this sense, if a woman wants to come to work by 9:30 and go 8 hours later, there should be the flexibility to do that. But of course, not for people to be working 16 hours.
Right. So we have come to the end of our episode today. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining with us today. I think this was a very fruitful conversation. And to summarize what we have discussed today so far, so we started off with the labor structure, and we talked about the female labor force participation and the difference between the gap between the labor force participation rates, and then how this crisis has affected the aging population in Sri Lanka and the migration, and we touched a little bit upon about the labor laws and the informal sectors of the country. And then finally we wrapped up our conversation by talking about the low-hanging fruit, which is the working hours. Thank you everyone for listening and watching the Race It Now podcast. See you again in the next episode.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.